Tonight, going for growth to tackle a housing crisis. The government slashes targets for affordable homes in London as house building faces a perfect storm. But could the government and the Mayor of London now face a political storm, accused of betraying election promises and of throwing low-income Londoners under a bus? We'll have a special report and we'll hear from the Housing Secretary and Sadiq Khan. Also tonight, Vladimir Putin says he will never bow to pressure from abroad after punitive US sanctions on Russian oil. But could economic pressure bring his war machine to a grinding halt? The Prime Minister says he's sticking by his safeguarding minister, Jess Phillips. There's 5 survivors advising the Grooming gang's inquiry say they will quit if she is ousted. We'll hear from one of them. On the eve of tomorrow's presidential election in Ireland, Dublin braces for a third night of unrest. We'll examine what is driving people to take to the streets. And also ahead, the history maker. The King attends a service in the Sistine Chapel, becoming the first British monarch to pray with the Pope since the Reformation. All that and more with our panel tonight. Caroline Flint and Salma Shah will be with us for the next hour. It's Thursday, I'm Darren McCaffrey, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. A very good evening. First tonight, in a major move aimed at tackling London's housing crisis, the government has slashed requirements for affordable homes in the capital. Under the city's mayor's own rules, 35% of new developments had to be affordable, but that's now been slashed to 20%. So Sadiq Khan has been under pressure as the government aims to hit its 1.5 million new homes target. Well, in a rare double interview, our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has been speaking with the Mayor of London and the new Housing Secretary, Steve Reid, and this is Sam's special report.
A building site that time forgot. One of the many across London counted as started but taken back by nature. New house building at the lowest level in decades. A crisis, but the toughest political choices mean losers as well as winners. And will there be an admission that things were off track?
We've got a housing crisis in London. Nothing like enough new homes being built to buy, to rent, social and affordable. This has been going on for about 3 years and the previous government chose to stand back and do nothing. What we're announcing today, me and the Mayor of London working together, is a package that is designed to get London building again by lowering the costs for developers so we get spades in the ground and start to build the homes that Londoners need to live in.
A cut in the affordable home requirement, which currently is 35%, now down to 20%. You accept this is big and controversial. Labour MPs are telling me that you and your team are literally warning them not to kick off about this in public. Stephen Coe being very tough about going public with criticism. One Labour MP told me this morning. Are you worried that you might not win the argument?
No, this is a positive announcement. There were only 4,000 starts in London last year for social and affordable housing. That is nothing like the scale of the crisis that we have. 35% of nothing is nothing. We need to make schemes viable for developers so they'll get spades in the ground and start to build them. As a result of the package we're announcing today, we will see more social and affordable homes built in London over the coming years than we've seen in the past few.
Sadiq Khan, what we've just heard from the Secretary of State there is actually really quite a damning indictment of where we are in London, a city that you've been mayor of now for many years. The government target in the first 9 months of this year was 66,000, but there were just 3,200 private starts, according to the analysts Mollier. This just seems dreadful. Whose fault is it?
Well, this is personal to me. I'm somebody who's born and raised on a council estate. A council home changed my family's life for the better. And that's why when I became mayor, I ditched the dodgy definition the previous mayor had. He built very few affordable homes, and those that he did were 80% of market value. But we face a perfect storm post-pandemic. The London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea didn't begin building one home last year. Forget affordable homes, one home. Harrow began building only 20 homes, not council homes, 20 homes overall.
But these rules were introduced by the mayor himself. They were a key aspect of his election campaigns.
Under my new London plan, every development in our city will be expected to include at least 35% genuinely affordable homes.
Do you concede you were wrong?
No, well, today's package of measures, which is a bold package, is temporary, it's short-term, and it's because there's an emergency we face, by the way, across the country.
Something doesn't quite add up. I just want you to have a look at this graph, Sadiq Khan. Now, this is a graph of the number of homes started and the number of homes completed. And you say that you started 25,000 affordable homes in the year before your 2024 re-election. But look at the completions line. And sure, there'll be a lag for building, but in the 7 London boroughs that we've got data for, at least 2,000 of the houses you counted as started being built in 2023 before your re-election are not started today. Can you explain that?
Quite easily. It's the perfect storm that we face. The price of concrete has gone up by more than 50%. The price of steel by more than 40%. In London, 96% of new builds are flats. We know that when it comes to the flats, you need to borrow. Interest rates have been at record levels. What about the impact of Brexit? What about the impact of the 2 staircases that are required on these 96% of homes? That's why construction has begun, but not been completed.
You have been talking about starts as if that led to completions. We've been to Ealing today to look at sites. Almost 1,000 homes in that borough alone haven't started, even though you were pointing out to the fact that they had started before the re-election bid. Have you been completely honest?
Let me be quite clear. Record numbers of council homes been built in London since the 1970s, records broken. Record numbers of homes completed in London, never seen since the 1930s. More completions of council homes, any year since records began in 2023, 2024.
Final question to the Secretary of State. Are you ready for the uproar that this is going to cause? There are 13,000 people rough sleeping in London in the last year. It's a record high, a 10% increase on the year before. Nearly 90,000 children are living in temporary accommodation. Are you sure that this package watering down requirements on house builders is the sort of thing Labour should be doing?
The effect of the package we're announcing today is that we will see more social and affordable homes built. That means we can get people off the streets, we can start to tackle the national scandal of temporary accommodation. It's not temporary at all. That's because this country has not been building, not because of the Mayor of London, but because of the inaction of the previous Conservative government. They under-resourced the building safety regulator. They didn't support house builders when they started to see the decline nationally, not just in London, 3 years ago. What the Mayor of London and I are doing today is announcing a package that will get spades in the ground in London so we can build the homes of every tenure for private rent, for people to buy and for social and council housing that we need to solve the housing crisis across this city.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Sam, as you can see, who was doing that interview with both Steve Reid and Sadiq Khan is in the studio, as is former Labour Minister Caroline Flint and the former Conservative Special Advisor Starmer, who we'll be speaking to in a second. Sam, what's fascinating here is that, from what I've seen, the government are rolling out one of their cabinet ministers to point out that the Labour Mayor of London is not doing terribly well.
I did feel a bit like that at points. Steve Reid was absolutely brutal about the situation to do with housing in the capital, and viewers will have noticed the slightly different tone taken by the Mayor of London. Let's decode the big picture politics of what's happened today. Sadiq Khan has done a massive U-turn, back down on something. He has for years put this affordable housing quota of 35% at the heart of a lot of his campaigning. He says that's part of who he is and where he comes from, and was very proud to do so. But the problem was that house builders say it was a big contribution, big reason why there weren't more affordable houses built, because it increased the cost, made them unviable for private developers to actually build these things. And house building in the capital has collapsed. Something had to give. And as it turns out, the thing that's given today is Sadiq Khan's principle on affordable housing, reduced from 35% to 20%. What was interesting in that interview is that when I pushed Sadiq Khan on that, he pointed in every other direction. We had Brexit, we had the cost of concrete, and all sorts, interest rates, as well as reasons why there's a collapse in house building. But in the end, the government have taken the action that I think house builders felt was needed. But it could come at the cost of a political backlash. There are, because I've spoken to them today, those in the Labour movement who think that this is not the right course of action to reduce the quota for house builders on affordable homes.
OK, Sam, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in our panel. Caroline, let's start with you. I mean, in many ways, the issue of making houses more affordable is ultimately, isn't it, to build more homes? Because that, in theory, would boost supply, potentially bring down prices and mean that more people could afford them.
Yeah, I mean, overall, we need more homes being built, not just in London, but across the country. And I always think when the term affordable is used, it's, you know, it means a lot of different things to different people. There's affordable for first-time buyers, there are below-market rents, but there's also social homes for those people for whom council housing used to be the answer, and lots of those people are now living in the private rented sector. I think what's happened here, and it's a positive, is that Steve Reed has made a pragmatic, realistic decision. If you have a target...
In overruling the Mayor of London?
Well, I wouldn't say overall, they clearly have come to an agreement because I think Sadiq Khan has accepted that this target needs to change. What is the point of having a target of 35%? Because 35% of nothing doesn't work. So by bringing it down to 20%, the key issue there is the private house developers seem to have welcomed it, fine, but the ball's in their court now. What are they going to do in terms of making sure those homes are built? And there are a few caveats in this for those private housing developers as well. Of the 20% target, 60% of them have to be at social rent value.
Yeah, OK.
So I think he's put in some other measures there. And I think I'm right, Sam. I think it's for 2 years, so we can come back to it. But I do think, you know, there has to be some agility in public policy if it's not working, and I think
Salman, just to pick up on that, I mean, you know, this is a government that today's demonstrating that they do actually want to reach a target. I mean, house building, we've not had enough homes in this country for decades. This Labour government seems prepared to take some action on that, no?
But the thing that I find quite interesting about this is that the Labour government today isn't saying anything different to what the Conservative government has said previously. There was a moment in the last Conservative administration, if you take everything together, that there was a push back against certain numbers in local authorities building a certain number of houses. But generally speaking, from my time in the housing department, this is very similar in terms of the policies that we had. The thing that I found really interesting about this is that there was no real mention of the public subsidy that has gone to the GLA, the Greater London Authority, from central government. I think by 2026, it will be to the tune of about £11 billion. So one has to ask, you know, where is that money being spent effectively? And if we are talking about supply, shouldn't we also be talking about demand? So where are the mortgages? Where is the piece that helps people who can't get a deposit, who maybe don't have an income that is going to get them to a level where they can afford London properties? How are we actually thinking about those products that will get people on the property ladder? It's not just about supply. Government doesn't have enough money to be able to push that supply through.
But it does seem, I would say today, demonstrating that actually it's a bit of a priority for them, something that, yeah, you're right, previous governments have talked about, but in the end didn't come to fore. And it is a manifesto commitment, so we'll see what happens. Sam, we have run out of time, I'm afraid. But thank you very much indeed, Sam Coates, joining us talking about housing with that special report. And you can get more from Sam online and indeed later on tonight here on Sky News. We're going to turn now, though, to the war in Ukraine, as the Russian President Vladimir Putin has responded to new US sanctions this evening, vowing that his country will never bow to pressure from abroad. The Trump administration sanctioned Russia's two biggest oil companies last night, criticising what was said to be a serious lack of commitment to a peace process. It comes as President Zelensky, who's been meeting with EU leaders in Brussels today, has described the move as crucial. It is a major policy shift from the American president, but how much, if any, of an impact will it have on Moscow's war economy? Our business and economic correspondent Paul Kelso has been taking a look.
The sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil are significant because they target the two biggest energy providers in Russia. Together, they produce more than half of Russia's fossil fuels, which in itself produces around 25% of the Kremlin's revenues, money that has been used to wage war on Ukraine. Now, the aim is to deny those companies access to the US financial system and all the other services that grease the wheels of the oil trade and try and cut revenues from fossil fuels that have actually stayed pretty robust. This chart shows us how much Russia has raked in from oil and gas since the war. Actually, after the invasion of Ukraine, the oil price went up and the Kremlin benefited. Now, it did dip after the EU and others said they wouldn't use Russian oil, but it was still around 800 million euros a day from oil. It's dipped down to closer to 600 million in the last year, but this is still a really significant amount of money. Now, why has it stayed so robust? Well, the answer is that the customers changed, but the volume of oil hasn't really. Let's have a look at how that has worked. Before the war, the EU was the biggest customer of Russian oil and gas, followed by China, Turkey, some others, the UK and India right down the bottom. Well, what happened next? The European Union said it wouldn't use oil, so it dropped down, hasn't weaned itself off gas. That's the remaining blue line. The UK, we were negligible anyway. It dwindled to nothing. Look at India down here, a tiny customer. It became the second biggest customer for Russian oil and gas, behind China, which was already buying a lot, also Turkey. We might call these allies of economic convenience for Vladimir Putin. They certainly have helped the Kremlin pay for the war. Look again, the volumes, they're not down that much, despite all the disdain for Russia. Now, India's under a lot of pressure from these sanctions. There was a punishment tariff of 25% imposed by Donald Trump last week because of the amount of oil they were using from Russia. This shows us the volumes that have come from Russia into India, and we break it down by the two companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. You can see well more than half of all the oil. Also a reminder of the grey area, that's other Russian companies who aren't sanctioned, who can continue trading. There's another factor here, perhaps the biggest factor of all, the oil price. Why now from Donald Trump? Well, the oil price is relatively low, $60 a day, a little spike of under 5% since this news, but that gives room to squeeze supply without hurting American consumers. The White House just as sensitive, if not more, to the price of petrol at the pumps than it is to foreign wars. The question now is whether this will work. The official word is that sanctions are meant to change behaviour, not punish the recipients. We'll have to see if that works this time with Vladimir Putin.
Well, in the last half hour, we've also heard from the White House press secretary, who said that the latest sanctions on oil firms in Russia were already putting pressure on the Kremlin. Let's listen.
You read the sanctions and look at them, they're pretty hefty. And I saw some international news out of China this morning that they're scaling back oil purchases from Russia. We know India has done the same at the request of the president. The president has also pushed European countries, our allies, to please stop their purchases of Russian oil as well. So it's full court press for sure. And we expect that these sanctions are going to do harm, as the Secretary of Treasury said yesterday.
Could there be more? Is this just the first step, or could there be more sanctions?
I'll leave that to the president to decide.
OK, well, let's bring in now Dr. Richard Conley, a fellow at RUSI and the author of Russia's Response to Sanctions. Richard, very good evening to you. Just first of all, what's your sense of the significance of what President Trump's done in the last 24 hours or so?
Good evening. Well, I think they're potentially significant, these new sanctions, but the real impact will depend on how effectively they're enforced, especially on third countries like India, China, and the UAE, which now handle, as your previous correspondent showed, most of Russia's oil trade. I think these measures will only bite if Washington can sustain the diplomatic and financial pressure on those countries to comply.
And the problem, of course, is that, as we saw there, two of the biggest consumers are China, who, you know what, can forge their own path in the world today, and also India, that have effectively fallen out with the United States before these sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And regardless of how effectively they're enforced, Russia will continue exporting oil. It's simply too important to global markets to disappear. It's the second largest exporter of crude. So I think what will change is how payments are made. So India and China may still import this, but they'll use different payment systems. They'll circumvent the use of dollars or European financial systems to reduce Western oversight and ensure that they can make payments without falling victim to secondary sanctions. So as a result of that, I don't expect there to be a dramatic collapse in export volumes. If we're lucky, we might see a reduction of around 10, 15% at most, but that's likely to be offset by higher prices, because if these sanctions are successful in reducing the volume of Russian oil on the global market, as we've seen today, prices are likely to rise. So in the end, what you might end up seeing is Russia still earning roughly the same amount of money that it was earning before these sanctions were put in place.
And that poses the next question, Richard, though, is that enough? Because, we've talked about sanctions now for years. We know that immediately after the invasion, that the harshest sanctions, I think, the West has ever imposed. And yet the Russian economy has proved to be pretty durable. Now, in part, that's because, of course, it ramped up its war economy, if you like. Where are we when we look at Russia's economy tonight? Well into this war, and a sense that that war economy, is it really genuinely starting to falter a little?
Growth is slowing. It has slowed in the course of the last 12 months. It was growing too quickly in the previous 2 years. It had grown over 4%, so the economy was overheating. I don't think it's close to crisis, but it is starting to experience greater stress than it has done. But I think what's important here is that these sanctions, if they are to have an impact on Russia's ability to sustain war in Ukraine, it really needs to hit Moscow's tax revenues. The problem is Russia tends to tax most of its oil companies at the pump when the oil comes out of the ground, rather than through export duties. So I don't think that the Kremlin's fiscal base is likely to shrink much as a result of these sanctions. So in the end, I don't think this move will be decisive. It might add a little bit of extra pressure and add another extra complication for Putin and those coordinating economic policy. But I think it's highly unlikely to alter Russia's ability or appetite to continue the war in Ukraine.
But it is interesting that the Kremlin have been, I don't know, they're being quite forceful, I would suggest, in the response today. I mean, they're clearly, as you say, it's not ideal news, no one's going to say that, but they've been quite forceful in the response, more so than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I don't think that they ever like or would welcome sanctions, especially from the United States, because I think it shows that there is a slight sort of rising frostiness in relations with Donald Trump, which is something that I think Mr. Putin would like to avoid. So they'll always respond rhetorically quite firmly against any sanctions, but I think behind closed doors, they'll probably be reasonably comfortable with what's happened today. It's certainly preferable, I think, to Donald Trump transferring Tomahawk missiles, for example, to Ukraine. I think that would have caused much greater tensions.
Well, it's really fascinating. And I just briefly on this, Richard, because I've read the opposite in the sense that actually Tomahawk missiles may well have an impact. And by the way, they could disrupt some of the oil supplies. We've seen Ukraine use weapons in that regard. But also that in the end, if this war is going to come to an end, it's probably not going to be won militarily. And it really is turning the scrum through the screw thumbs, rather, on the Russian economy that will ultimately bring this to an end.
Yeah, I guess that depends on your take on how robust and resilient the Russian economy has proven and is likely to prove in the future. I think it surprised most analysts, most politicians over the course of the last 3.5 years. And I don't think we've seen anything to date, any overwhelming evidence that the picture has radically changed. Yes, things are getting a bit more difficult. Yes, their budget's under greater strain, but they're still a long way off, I think, being in a position where they would feel compelled to come to the negotiating table and be forced to accept some form of peace.
OK. Richard, we really appreciate your time and your insights this evening, Dr. Richard Connolly there. Thank you very much indeed. You can always tell when I enjoy an interview when I really should stop the interview, but he says something and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, but I've read something differently. Salma, what's your take on all of this? And because, I mean, Richard's right in the sense that, wow, the Russian economy has been way more resilient than anyone has suggested, particularly in that place across the road over the last couple of years.
I think there is a tendency, particularly with Ukrainian allies, to slightly overplay how much impact we're having on the Russian economy, or how much pushback or how many victories we've had on the battlefield against Russia. And I think we have to be realists about the situation. And being a realist about the situation may mean that actually we do need to apply more pressure to Washington for them to release those Tomahawk missiles to Zelensky, because I take your point that you just made in that interview that actually providing sanctions is about weakening the economy and then strengthening our hand. We are not going to be able to get to a negotiated settlement that actually aids Ukraine and its territories and its sovereign territory if we are not able to make impact with Russia directly. And it increasingly feels like we have to get the balance right militarily and not just with things like sanctions, which we heard have limited impact.
What's also fascinating here, Caroline, is obviously the role of President Trump. you know, someone who I think it's pretty obvious he does not like President Zelensky on a personal basis, and he puts a lot of sway on personal relationships. But he does seem to like some other big actors in this narrative, not least of all the NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, who clearly gets called over to Washington when things look like they're in trouble from the West point of view.
Well, I mean, Trump has actually had some success in terms of NATO, and Mark Rutte has responded, actually, to the charge that other NATO partners weren't playing their part. They weren't stepping up to put the amount of contributions into things. So, I mean, in some respects, you know, actually that has been a win for America. I think in relationship to, obviously we all remember that interview, the press conference with Zelensky, it was absolutely awful.
Well, apparently it was a shouting match in the White House also last Friday.
Yeah. But I think actually what's interesting here is that what we're seeing is, for the first time really, since Trump was re-elected, is a bit of losing patience with Putin, who he did see as someone, maybe more so than Zelensky, that he could pick up the phone and talk man to man and get the job done. In his, And of course we had it's a bit of deja vu, isn't it? Because we had the Alaska meeting in August. That didn't achieve really anything. But now what we're seeing is fewer carrots being put Putin's way in terms of his demands, and maybe a few more sticks. And I think you're right, Salma, about the military effort and making sure that that's maintained. But I do think, in their own way, these economic decisions are actually important as well. It is true that, you know, as we saw from the graph, China and India are big users of this. But again, at the same time, China and India are also in discussion with the US about the tariffs. So there's a combination of things going on here that they could put pressure on Russia as well. And don't forget, in the last week, the European Union has agreed that looking at the frozen assets, we're going to have more of that.
And that could be quite
Ukraine.
Just briefly on this, Salma, look, this is down to a erratic US president, isn't it, who does seem to change his mind, at least publicly, quite frequently.
Well, yes, indeed. But the one thing that we hear he maintains is his desperation to have a Nobel Peace Prize. And if that is what incentivizes this guy to bring peace to the world, fine.
If it works.
But it needs to work, exactly.
Well, and I think he possibly recognises that himself, but it is fascinating and sometimes quite difficult to work out where he is. But as people say, sometimes that's based on the last conversation he had. Right, we're going to pause on that thought because we're going to take a break here on the Politics Hub. Coming up after the break on this Thursday evening, after calls for Jess Phillips to resign, 5 grooming gang survivors have actually said they backed the minister and that they would quit if she was ousted. We've been speaking to one of them who believes that Ms Phillips should remain in post. We'll be talking about that after the break. Do stay tuned.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling.
It's not his country, it's ours.
Sky News, the full story first, free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in.
You're watching the Politics Hub here on Sky News. Now, the row over the handling of the national inquiry into grooming gangs and the safeguarding minister's role in the process has deepened once again. 5 grooming gang survivors said they would only continue working with the inquiry if Jess Phillips actually stays in post. That's after 4 others quit the panel and said they would only return if she resigned. Well, Sky News has been speaking to Samantha Walker-Roberts, one of the 5 survivors on the panel, who say they'll only remain part of the process if Phillips also stays in post. And they said the safeguarding minister has been fair and honest with those involved.
We've never had a national inquiry like this before. We've had the ICTA report, but that was nothing like what we are having now. This is our chance to build something from the ground up, which is survivor-led, where everybody's involved and everybody gets a voice. And we shouldn't be falling apart right now. We should be working together.
You and others have written a letter in support of Jess Phillips, and you, out of all of them, as the only person who's decided, and we're grateful for this, decided to relinquish your anonymity. Why have you written in support of Jess Phillips?
Because Jess has only been fair and honest with us. She's told as much as she possibly can within her capacity at the time of when things have been happening. She's provided a lot of support over the phone and in person to a lot of us survivors behind the scenes, which people don't see that of Jess. So I do still want her to be part of this inquiry up until the end.
Well, you, of course, can watch Matt's full interview with Samantha Walker-Roberts at 8 p.m. tonight, immediately after this programme, on the UK Tonight. Well, our political correspondent, Rob Powell, is in the studio with more on this. Rob, this is a really difficult, complex issue that we've been covering all week here on the Politics Hub. But let's also be honest about this. There is politics at play here as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of politics. I mean, it was politics that sort of forced this back into the spotlight and got us to the place, I guess, where an inquiry was announced in the first place. So, you know, politics is always at play, I guess. I think there's a question about whether it's almost got too political now and that the kind of the noise that's spinning around it is actually seemingly sabotaging the actual process. You've obviously had this argument about Jess Phillips, which the Conservatives have jumped on and pushed. You've got a disagreement seemingly between 2 groups of survivors that are participating in the setting up of the panel. But I think reading the letter that's gone today to the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister by 5 survivors, actually the more interesting bit is about what they think the inquiry should be full stop, rather than this row about whether Jess Phillips stays in place. Because the letter that's gone today from this group, they want this inquiry to be broader than just looking at grooming gangs. They say that might miss out some other people that have experiences and have been abused in ways that didn't fit into that definition. Now, if you think back to yesterday, the 4 people that were calling for Jess Phillips to go...
It was going to be too big in its
Exactly.
scope.
They were saying exactly the opposite. So there does seem to be a disagreement about what actual shape this inquiry should have from the people that are involved in it, the victims and the survivors. This letter today as well has also criticised the size of this liaison panel, which essentially is the body that the 4 people yesterday resigned from. They say it's got too big, essentially, and that there weren't enough clauses, confidentiality clauses, put on to basically prevent what we've had in the last 2 or 3 days. They feel that a lot of people have opposing views within this panel, but they haven't been able to kind of thrash those views out behind closed doors, because what has happened is it's been played out in the media and some people have essentially felt silenced once again because of having opposing views to others on the panel.
OK, Rob, thank you very much indeed. Rob Powell there with the latest on this story, and it is going to feature, of course, in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us tonight will be the Daily Telegraph's Associate Political Editor, Tony Diver, and the Politicus journalist, Zoe Grandewalt. That is from 10:30 tonight here on Sky News. As you can see, Caroline and Salma are still with me in the studio. This has got really complicated. It has got really political. I think I heard today the Prime Minister was calling some people up on this panel, to find out where the support is. Has it become almost too difficult?
Yes, and, both Caroline and I have worked in the Home Office, and the thing that really struck me about this is getting somebody to actually chair it, because this isn't just about Jess Phillips as a minister who is going to oversee this from the government. This is about that question as to why this inquiry is even there in the first place. It's a question of trust. And if you have survivors with disagreements on the panel, who is going to be able to chair that liaison committee and chair that inquiry effectively so that all those voices feel like they're heard, that it gets to an outcome that the government can actually do something about? And the worst thing for this inquiry at the moment is that it's played out in the media and nobody serious wants to take this on because it becomes politically toxic to step into that role.
And on that, Caroline, we've been saying all week that, to be fair to Jess Phillips, she clearly very much cares about this issue and she's been consistent on it for a very long period of time. But this is now a political issue, too divisive.
This shouldn't be about Jess Phillips. This should be about...
But but the problem is for some of the survivors it is about Jess Phillips.
Of course it is. But the primary goal now must be is to get the inquiry back on track. There is... to be honest, I feel really sad that we've got these women, all of whom, maybe in different ways, have been abused. And what's being played out now is one group of survivors pitted against another group of survivors. That is awful because, the proud and the good can stand by, whether it's politicians or police officers or social workers. Fundamentally, these women who were girls, many of whom were under the age of consent, have been completely let down for decades. So we've got to get onto, and Louise Casey, I understand, is being asked by the Prime Minister to step in, to do what Starmer's just said, to get back on track. What was the purpose of this inquiry? Who do we need to chair it? And to provide those assurances to these women. Because at the moment, it really isn't, it shouldn't be about Jess Phillips. What they feel let down by, some of the women who came out, was feeling like, for example, you've got a group of women who've probably maybe never been involved in an inquiry before, maybe sat alongside lawyers and all these other people, all the proud and the good who are used to this sort of thing. They're asked to fill in a confidentiality statement. Now, we can all understand the reasons for that, but there's a sensitivity about that and how you handle it.
But isn't this the problem, though? It's become political this week because of politicians. So one set of survivors would point to Jess Phillips' response to that urgent question in Parliament not helping, and others would point to Kemi Badenoch clearly deciding, doing this at PMQs to make it a political issue.
But arguably, the reason why the Leader of the Opposition has brought this up is because there is still dissatisfaction with the way that this... there have been several inquiries prior to this one on the issue of grooming gangs, that actually it hasn't addressed some of the local issues that still exist for a lot of people. And whether that be around, the local councils, the social workers, police officers that were involved in what was essentially letting down victims of abuse. And so it's come up to a national inquiry, which was against what the government wanted, but they acquiesced and they've taken this on board. But this is politics. It's the question of trust over data and practicalities. And this is the fundamental thing that we have to do in our democracies, is find the accommodation between two opposing but equally valid groups of people and understanding it. And we have to have the conflict in order to bring that forward. And the resolution, how do we resolve this is the question.
Well, and that's the big question. And it's now a big question, it must be said, for the Prime Minister himself.
Yeah, of course it is. And to be honest, it's not going to be resolved by sacking a minister. It's going to be resolved by getting back to what this whole purpose of this inquiry was, reassuring people. And actually, if it takes it, to be honest, reaching out across the party political divide, maybe I'm too optimistic about that, I don't know. But it's in the interest of these women and any other girl in the future who is abused to get this right. And I think reaching out across the political divide, I don't think the House of Commons, the bear pit it is the place for sorting this out. It's not going to help those women. Whatever side they take in relation to Jess Phillips, what has to happen is to get the inquiry back on track, restore confidence, restore trust, and recognise, for many of these women, being exposed and involved in these sort of proceedings is something maybe they haven't had before. And therefore they don't come with, you know, the experience of some of that. And they will see certain things like confidential agreements, like saying things, unfortunately, I think there was a misuse of language, untrue, as almost like a trigger back to what they've experienced in the past.
That is the absolute sensitivity, which is understanding that when you bring a group of survivors together, they're not one homogenous whole, and that the formalities of government committees are not necessarily...
And I think that's what we've seen now play out this week, is almost kind of like the logistics and formalities of kind of government and politics meeting with kind of raw emotion and a really traumatic past history. But it is a difficult one, and it is a story, you know, that is definitely going to run and run over the next couple of weeks until we get some type of consensus. OK, for the moment, thank you very much indeed, because we are going to take another break here on the Politics Hub. Up next, rather, we're going to go to Ireland, because Dublin is bracing itself for a third night of unrest. We'll be asking what's taking people onto the streets ahead of a presidential election there tomorrow. Welcome back. Now, Dublin is braced for another night of unrest. It comes after a second consecutive evening of violent disorder near an asylum hotel in the city. Demonstrations have been taking place outside the City West Hotel following an alleged sexual assault in the early hours of Monday morning. Gardaí have said that 31 people have been arrested in relation to the disorder, and 4 Garda members were injured and were treated in hospital, but have subsequently been discharged. Well, it comes as tomorrow Ireland holds a presidential election. Joining me now is the executive editor of the Irish Independent, Kevin Doyle. Very good evening to you, Kevin. I suppose, first of all, let's focus on the violence we've seen the last couple of nights. And this is, and we've seen this before, clearly from people who are opposed to the level of migration into Ireland.
Yeah, for context, Darren, this hotel, City West, it's a big conference centre, over 700 rooms. But in the past year, the government has actually taken it over and it is now used exclusively for people who are seeking asylum here, but also for Ukrainian refugees. And actually, the majority of people staying there at the moment are Ukrainian refugees. But it has become a bit of a flashpoint because obviously locals in that area feel that hundreds of people are now being brought in for what was once a public amenity and has now become a long-term asylum centre. And then we had this incident on Monday night where it is alleged a 10-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. A man has appeared in court in relation to that, and it is believed he was. Our Parliament has been told that he should have actually been subject of a deportation order already and shouldn't have been in the country at the time. So that has been the spark for what we've seen the last few nights.
Yeah, and Kevin, obviously, we are seeing this, and we saw riots in Dublin as well, but it is a narrative that here in the UK we've seen play out as well. And migration is a political issue, a burning political issue in Ireland.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost exactly 2 years since we had the Dublin riots, which were in Dublin city centre, caused extensive damage. Trams burnt out, police assaulted, a lot of people injured, shops looted. This is nothing on the scale of that, but it is very reminiscent of that. And I guess what we've had in the last 2 years is moments, if you like, incidents that have popped up at different parts around the country, not just in Dublin, when there are incidents or when people object to local facilities being taken over for asylum centres. But this is the worst, certainly, that we have seen since those really, really bad riots 2 years ago.
OK, Kel, let's turn to the presidential election. Not connected in any way in the sense that the Irish president has a ceremonial role, but the election itself is a political campaign, if you like. And it seems that Catherine Connolly is going to win. And she is someone who has had an interesting political career, to put it frankly.
Well, I think that's fair to say. And one interesting point, Darren, you would imagine that with riots taking place on the streets, that they would become a big issue in the presidential election. But for a variety of reasons, we've ended up with two candidates. One who is essentially the government candidate, and therefore the government is obviously in many ways being blamed for what is happening. And the other candidate, Catherine Connolly, who you say is very much a left-wing candidate who is very pro-migration and wouldn't be one to she would criticise the government policy on this, but she would have no issue with people coming into the country. So it's not an issue at all, bizarrely, in the presidential election, even though you'd expect it. On Catherine Connolly, she's an independent TD, Member of Parliament, but she actually has the backing of all the left-wing parties in the Dáil. And indeed, Simon Harris, our Taoiseach, who has Heather Humphreys as his candidate in the race, he's describing her as hard left. And I think a lot of people would actually subscribe to that. But she is 20 points ahead in the opinion polls. And barring some sort of freak result tomorrow, she will be the 10th president of Ireland.
And just briefly, Kevin, on that, she's also someone who wants to see a united Ireland. And this may, increasingly, with the increase of support for Sinn Féin, become an issue in the years to come.
Well, Sinn Féin decided not to take part in this presidential election or not to run their own candidate. They gave Catherine Connolly their backing on the understanding that she would speak out, and if she became president, she would use that role to advocate for a united Ireland. She has said she will do that. Of course, the president is not a political figure, but it is something that she has put on her ticket as one of her top issues if she gets into the presidency over the weekend.
OK, Kevin, great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Kevin Doyle there, joining us live from Dublin tonight. And of course, we will have coverage of that presidential election throughout the weekend here on Sky News Voting. Tomorrow, we're expecting the result, I think, on Saturday. Now, we're going to take a break. Up next, though, a moment in history as King Charles becomes the first British monarch to pray with the Pope in 500 years. Quite a moment. We'll be talking about its significance. Or maybe the lack of significance, actually, after the break.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles. Sky News, the full story first.
I'm Martin Brunt and I'm Sky's crime correspondent.
I'm David Blevins.
and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I've spent 30 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
Free wherever you get your news. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Liberation Day.
By popular demand, here we are.
Donald Trump. It is quite the story. Wherever it goes, on Trump 100, we go with it.
Can you tell us who you're looking for?
Unbelievable we've come to this.
Are you overstating the reach and significance of this deal?
Not like you said it.
From the UK.
Why don't you go back to your country where you have a major migrant problem?
It was 10 feet from him, and all of a sudden the shots rang out.
People impacted.
I'll tell you on another day on the podcast what that was all about.
Join us wherever you get your podcasts.
Go ahead, back white jacket.
Deborah Haynes from Sky News. He called you Daddy earlier.
No, he did it very affectionately. Daddy, you're my daddy. Thank you.
Leicester is on its knees.
They've ripped the soul out of my factory and there's nothing left.
It is eerily quiet.
It's constantly on the brink of capacity.
There's overcrowding. It's not a new thing.
It's rough.
There's nothing to hide. Why aren't international journalists allowed in?
Are you worried about escalation?
Of course I'm worried about escalation, which is why my focus is on de-escalation.
The region, I think, is on edge because they are anticipating a retaliation.
Iran retaliates for the US attacks.
The founding principle of the alliance, that an attack on one is an attack on all.
Could Putin attack another NATO country within 5 years?
Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Now, here on the Politics Hub, we always bring you the news that matters. But let's be honest, sometimes it can be news today, but gone tomorrow. And while we do sometimes also overplay the unprecedented and historic, we can genuinely say today will end up in the history books. Why? Because, well, as you can see, it was the first time an English monarch and the Pope joined together for prayer in 500 years since the Reformation, when back in 1534 King Henry VIII, of course, declared himself head of the Church of England and broke with the Roman Catholic Church. 500 years. Wow. Well, today's more secular Britain, I think, has kind of forgotten just how much the Reformation, religion, has played its part in the history of these islands. How much until recently it dominated everyone's lives. How much it's moulded actually our reality today. And let's not forget that King Charles is not just the head of state, but he's also the head of the established church here, the Anglican Church. And it may not feel like it, but the UK constitutionally very much does not have a separation of church and state. It wasn't that long ago that you had to be pretty much a Protestant to be Prime Minister. And it's also now reported that Prince William, the future monarch, is keen on diluting the relationship even further with the removal, largely, of the religious aspects of his future coronation. The events in Rome were clearly very personal for the king. Religious understanding and cooperation have been pretty central to his entire public life. But this was more than personal. It was, let's be honest about this, a moment of importance for us as a nation. But also given the fact that religion, Christianity, seemed to matter way less than they did probably at any moment over the last 1,500 years. Yes, it was a moment in history, but it also felt like its significance may be moving into history too. Do you see what I did there? Right, let's bring in the panel tonight. Caroline and Salma is still with us there. I was trying to be clever, But it was a moment. I mean, the picture's also amazing. And let's be honest about this, given the week the King's had, probably some relief, actually.
Yes, I mean, if there's anyone you want to go and pray with after the week that the monarch's had, it probably is the Pope. Look, I find this fascinating because I think you set out the context beautifully in your introduction.
It's very kind of you, very kind.
It is true about what part does religion still play in our public life? And, you know, I was brought up in the Muslim faith. My husband was brought up in the Christian faith, and he's quite a devout Christian. I wouldn't say I was a devout Muslim, but, you know, religion has an important part in my life. And why is that? Because especially if you're in public life and you are making choices that are about politics, economics, ethics, morality, I think, is an important part of it as well. And I think organised religion and the way people think about it now, it's not really akin to what religion or, you know, any kind of that formal structure can give you. And you have other things, in my view, that have sort of supplanted it, which are things like, you know, wellness regimes and people wanting to go off and do that thing. But
people will also say that we're kind of like culturally still, let's say, a Christian country, for example. You know, we're going to have Halloween next week and Christmas is coming up. That it's still there even if people aren't going to church, though apparently church attendances are on the rise.
I mean, I think that actually faith is still really important to a huge number of people. I think 50% of the world are actually Christian, and then about 1.5 billion are Catholics. I mean, the historical relevance of this is really interesting, given it was actually trying to get a divorce that led to the split. I don't think Henry VIII was a particular, you know, pro-religious reformer, but I think actually, in some ways, you know. Communities came together under a set of belief to explain the world around them. How did we get here? What happened? Were there gods? Was there one god or many gods? And in some ways, I think, you know, even where people aren't necessarily strictly following their faith, whatever faith that may be, there's certain values that are brought into that about how you should behave, right and wrong, what family means, what community means. And in different ways with these festivals, let's be honest about it, things like Christmas and Easter, the Christians were very good because they basically replaced the pagan festivals. Of course. Christian festivals. So I think there's still that there, and that's important.
But just very briefly on this, and we've got 45 seconds to ask a big constitutional question, but I really mean this as in what we could see is the disestablishment of the church. It seems if King William, when becomes King William...
I think it would be an error, because if we are to retain our influence, our geopolitical influence in the Commonwealth, we have to recognise that people of faith like faith. And that is true in the UK as well. In looking at it, as even if you're not a Christian, you do like this, that perhaps the ceremony and the faith aspect of it.
OK, well, there you go. We've definitely ended on a big thought tonight. I don't think anyone could claim that. Caroline Salma, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening here on the Politics Hub. Indeed, that is it for us for tonight. You can watch the highlights programme over the weekend. Don't forget that. There'll be continuing political coverage, of course, here on Sky News. Do stay tuned, though. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Matt Barbet, including that interview with a survivor who's calling for Jess Phillips to remain in post. Do stay tuned for that and have a very good weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Goodbye.